First story, The Alien Prophecy, Japan, 1973. It was a crisp autumn morning in 1973 when I decided to take a walk through the dense forests near my home in rural Japan. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the leaves crunched softly beneath my feet as I made my way along the familiar path. I'd walked this route countless times before, but something felt different that day. There was a strange electricity in the air, a tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The birds had fallen silent, and even the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine, despite the warm sunlight filtering through the canopy above. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing no more than 20 feet away, stood a group of beings unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were small, barely reaching my waist in height, with bodies that seemed too thin and fragile to be real. Their skin was a pale silvery grey color that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dappled sunlight. But it was their eyes that truly captured my attention. Large, dark, and almond-shaped, they seemed to bore right through me, as if they could see every thought and memory in my mind. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from these strange creatures as possible. But I couldn't move. It was as if their gaze had rooted me to the spot, holding me there against my will. As I stood there trembling, I realized that despite their alien appearance, these beings didn't seem overtly threatening. There was no aggression in their posture, no weapons in their hands. Instead, they radiated an aura of power. It was like standing in the presence of something ancient and unknowable, something that existed on a level far beyond human comprehension. I felt small and insignificant in comparison, like an ant facing a giant. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I wanted to speak, to ask who they were and what they wanted, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me. Just as I thought I might collapse from the sheer intensity of the moment, something even stranger happened. The air in front of me began to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. At first, I thought it was just my vision blurring from fear and adrenaline. But as I watched, transfixed, the distortion coalesced into a clear image. A vision hovering in the air before me, as real and solid as if I were watching it on a television screen. The vision showed our planet, Earth, suspended in the vast emptiness of space. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a blue and green jewel set against the backdrop of stars. For a moment, I felt a surge of pride and wonder at the sight of our home, but that feeling was quickly replaced by horror as the image began to change. Fires erupted across the surface of the planet, spreading like a malignant infection. Massive storms formed over the oceans, their swirling clouds looking like angry fists ready to strike. Floods inundated coastal areas, swallowing up entire cities in their relentless advance. I watched, helpless and horrified, as earthquakes tore the land apart, and volcanoes spewed ash and lava into the darkening skies. It was as if every natural disaster imaginable had been unleashed upon the earth at once, a perfect storm of destruction that threatened to wipe out everything we had ever known or built. The worst part was the sense of inevitability that came with the vision. This wasn't just a possibility or a warning. It felt like a glimpse into a future that was already set in stone, a fate that we were hurtling towards with no way to change course. Tears streamed down my face as I watched our world burn, my mind reeling from the implications of what I was seeing. Was this why the aliens had come? To show us the end of our world? Or were they somehow responsible for the catastrophe unfolding before my eyes? As suddenly as it had appeared, the vision vanished, leaving me gasping for air and struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my head and reorient myself to my surroundings. But when I looked back to where the strange beings had been standing, they were gone. The clearing was empty, with no sign that anyone or anything had ever been there. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky and weak, half convinced that I must have imagined the whole thing. But as I reached the spot where they had stood, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The grass and undergrowth were flattened in a perfect circle, as if something heavy had been resting there. And in the center of the circle, the earth was scorched black, still warm to the touch when I hesitantly placed my hand upon it. This wasn't a hallucination or a dream. It had been real, all of it. The aliens, the vision, the warning. It had all happened right here in this quiet forest that I'd known all my life. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of what I'd experienced. The world around me suddenly seemed fragile and precarious, like a soap bubble on the verge of bursting. How could I go back to my normal life knowing what I now knew? How could I look at the people around me, going about their daily routines, without wanting to scream at them about the fate that awaited us all? I don't know how long I sat there in that clearing, trying to make sense of it all. The sun had begun to set by the time I finally found the strength to stand and make my way back home. Every step felt like I was moving through a dream, the familiar forest path now seeming alien and threatening. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw the lights of my house in the distance, I nearly broke down in relief. But as I approached my home, a new fear gripped me. How could I possibly explain what had happened to my family? Would they even believe me? Or would they think I'd lost my mind? I paused at the doorstep, my hand hovering over the knob as I wrestled with these questions. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, at least for the time being. I needed time to process it all, to try and understand the meaning behind the vision I'd been shown. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those alien faces, their dark eyes boring into my soul. And behind them, always, was the image of our planet burning. I knew then that my life would never be the same. The warning remained, etched into my mind like a brand, impossible to ignore or forget. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to go about my normal routine, but it was like moving through a fog. Everything seemed muted and distant, unimportant in the face of what I'd seen. I found myself obsessively watching the news, searching for any signs that the catastrophic future I'd glimpsed might be coming true. Every report of a natural disaster or environmental crisis sent my heart racing, convinced that this was the beginning of the end. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams where I relived the encounter in the forest over and over again. Sometimes, in the dreams, the aliens spoke to me, their voices like static in my mind, trying to convey some crucial message that I could never quite understand. I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, the echo of their unintelligible words ringing in my ears. My family and friends began to notice the change in me. They commented on how distracted I seemed, how I'd sometimes trail off mid-sentence, lost in thought. I could see the concern in their eyes, but how could I explain what was really going on? How could I burden them with the knowledge that had been thrust upon me? So I made excuses, blamed stress at work, or lack of sleep. But I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. The weight of my secret was slowly crushing me, isolating me from the people I cared about most. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself drawn back to the forest, time and time again. I'd spend hours wandering the paths, searching for any sign of the beings I'd encountered, or some clue that might help me make sense of what had happened. But the forest remained stubbornly ordinary, revealing nothing but the usual sights and sounds of nature. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of something small and gray darting between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Was I going crazy? Or were they still out there observing me from the shadows? The uncertainty was maddening. I started carrying a camera with me on my walks, desperate to capture some evidence of what I'd seen. But the photos always came out blurry or obscured, showing nothing but trees and underbrush. I began to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I had imagined the whole thing after all. But then I'd remember the scorched earth in that clearing, the undeniable physical proof that something had happened, and I knew deep in my bones that what I'd experienced was real. The vision of Earth's destruction haunted me constantly. I found myself poring over scientific journals and environmental reports, trying to piece together a timeline for the catastrophe I'd seen. Climate change, pollution, deforestation, all of it seemed to be leading us down the path to that fiery future. I started making changes in my own life, becoming almost fanatical about reducing my carbon footprint and living sustainably. I badgered my family and friends to do the same, lecturing them about the importance of protecting the environment. Most of them humored me, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They didn't understand the urgency, the desperation that drove me. How could they when they hadn't seen what I had seen? My obsession began to take a toll on my relationships. My wife grew increasingly frustrated with my behavior, my constant preoccupation with environmental issues and alien encounters. We argued more and more, the distance between us growing wider with each passing day. I knew I was pushing her away, but I couldn't stop myself. The weight of the knowledge I carried was too heavy to bear alone, but I didn't know how to share it without sounding like a madman. One night, about 6 months after my encounter in the forest, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I'd had another dream about the aliens, but this time it was different. Instead of the usual confused jumble of images and sensations, the dream had been crystal clear. In it, the beings had spoken to me directly, their thoughts appearing in my mind as if they were my own. They told me that the future I'd seen wasn't set in stone. There was still time to change course, to avert the disaster that loomed on the horizon. But it would take a massive global effort. Humanity would have to come together, to put aside its differences and work towards a common goal. As I sat there in the darkness, the details of the dream still vivid in my mind, I felt a surge of hope for the first time in months. This wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to find a way to share what I'd learned, to convince others of the urgency of our situation. But how? Who would believe the ravings of one man about an alien encounter in the woods? I needed proof, something concrete that would make people sit up and take notice. With renewed determination, I threw myself into researching UFO sightings and alien encounters. I scoured newspapers, magazines, and online forums for any reports that might corroborate my experience. To my surprise and relief, I found that I wasn't alone. There were others out there who claimed to have seen similar beings, who spoke of receiving warnings about Earth's future. Some of their stories were eerily similar to my own, describing small grey creatures and visions of global catastrophe. It was both comforting and terrifying to know that others had gone through what I had. I reached out to some of these individuals, cautiously at first, using anonymous online accounts. As we shared our experiences, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Finally, I could talk openly about what had happened to me without fear of judgment or ridicule. We formed a sort of support group, sharing theories and discussing the implications of our encounters. But even as I found solace in this community, a nagging doubt persisted. Were we really onto something? Or were we just a bunch of delusional people enabling each other's fantasies? As I delved deeper into the world of UFO research, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There were reports, scattered across different countries and spanning several decades, of people who had gone missing after claiming to have contact with extraterrestrial beings. Some had vanished while on solo hikes or camping trips, much like my own encounter in the forest. Others had disappeared from their homes, leaving behind confused and heartbroken families. The official explanations varied: accidents, runaways, mental breakdowns, but to me the pattern was clear. These people had seen something they weren't supposed to see, and someone or something had silenced them. I couldn't help but wonder, was I on borrowed time? Had I escaped a similar fate only because I'd kept my experience to myself for so long? The thought sent chills down my spine, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, jumping at every unexpected sound. I installed new locks on my doors and windows, and I rarely ventured out after dark. My wife thought I was becoming paranoid, and maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment they might come for me. Despite my fears, I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. The warning I'd received was too important, the stakes too high. I decided to write down my experience in detail, creating multiple copies and hiding them in various locations. If anything happened to me, at least there would be a record of what I'd seen and learned. I also began reaching out to scientists and environmental activists, trying to share my knowledge without revealing its source. I'd present them with carefully researched data on climate change and environmental degradation, hoping to spur them into action. Some dismissed me as just another crackpot, but others listened. I like to think that in some small way, I contributed to the growing awareness of the ecological crisis facing our planet, but it never felt like enough. The image of that burning Earth was always in the back of my mind, driving me to do more, to push harder. I started having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares and anxiety. My health began to suffer, and my relationships continued to deteriorate. I was becoming a shell of my former self, consumed by the mission that had been thrust upon me. One night, about a year after my initial encounter, I woke up suddenly, every nerve in my body tingling with a strange energy. The room was filled with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I sat up in bed, my heart racing, I saw them. The same small grey beings from the forest were standing at the foot of my bed there, large eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like my very soul was being examined. My wife lay next to me, unnaturally still and silent, as if frozen in time. I wanted to shake her awake, to cry out for help, but I found myself unable to move or speak. The aliens communicated with me telepathically, their thoughts flowing into my mind like a stream of cool water. They showed me more visions, not just of the potential destruction of our world, but also of a future where humanity had heeded their warnings. I saw gleaming cities powered by clean energy, vast forests reclaiming once barren lands, and oceans teeming with life. The contrast between these two possible futures was stark and heartbreaking. They impressed upon me the urgency of our situation, the razor's edge upon which the fate of our planet balanced. I felt the weight of their expectations, the unspoken command to do more, to be the catalyst for change they believed I could be. When I came to my senses again, the sun was streaming through the windows, and my wife was shaking me awake, concern etched on her face. I had apparently been thrashing and muttering in my sleep, caught in the grip of what she assumed was a terrible nightmare. But I knew it had been more than that. The encounter felt as real and visceral as the one in the forest, perhaps even more so. The alien's message echoed in my mind, impossible to ignore or forget. I tried to explain to my wife what had happened, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed rush. But as I spoke, I could see the doubt and worry in her eyes. She didn't believe me. How could she? To her, and to the rest of the world, it must have sounded like the ravings of a man on the brink of a mental breakdown. And maybe that's exactly what was happening to me. The strain of carrying this knowledge, of trying to change the course of human history, was taking its toll. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, the line between what was real and what was imagined becoming increasingly blurred. But even if I was losing my mind, did that make the message any less important? Didn't we still need to act, to change our ways before it was too late? In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my mission with renewed vigor. I wrote letters to politicians and business leaders, pleading with them to take drastic action on climate change. I organized local environmental groups and participated in protests. I gave interviews to anyone who would listen, carefully skirting around the true source of my knowledge, but emphasizing the dire consequences of inaction. Some people were moved by my passion and conviction, joining my cause and spreading the message further. Others dismissed me as an alarmist or a lunatic. The strain on my personal life intensified. My wife, at her wit's end, finally delivered an ultimatum. Either I seek professional help, or she would leave. My children looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity, as if I were a stranger wearing their father's face. I knew I was losing them, but I couldn't stop. The fate of the world seemed to rest on my shoulders, and I couldn't let the aliens down. I couldn't let humanity down. So I pushed on, even as my world crumbled around me. I told myself it was worth it, that the sacrifice of my personal happiness was a small price to pay for the future of our planet. But in my darkest moments, alone in the night, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. Had the aliens chosen the wrong person? Was I really making a difference, or was I just destroying my life for nothing? Years have passed since that fateful day in the forest, and I still don't have all the answers. The world hasn't ended, but neither has it dramatically changed course. We're still hurtling towards an uncertain future, teetering on the brink of environmental disaster. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. The aliens, the visions, the warnings. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something in the sky, a flash of movement in the woods, and that old familiar feeling will wash over me. They're still out there, watching and waiting. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to carry the weight of what I know without letting it crush me. I've rebuilt some of the relationships I nearly destroyed in my frantic quest to save the world. My wife and I have reconciled, though there's still a shadow between us, a part of me she can never fully understand or accept. My children have grown, and while they view my environmental activism with a mixture of pride and embarrassment, they've never known the full truth of what drives me. I've found a balance of sorts. I still work tirelessly to raise awareness about environmental issues, but I've learned to do it in a way that doesn't alienate everyone around me. I've joined forces with scientists and activists who share my concerns, even if they don't share my experiences. Together, we're making small but meaningful changes, pushing for policies and technologies that might just help us avoid the apocalyptic future I was shown. Second story. The night the mountains vanished, Romania, 1968. It was just another night on the road. I'd been driving for hours, hauling a load of timber from the forests near Suceava to a processing plant in Bucharest. The clock on my dash read 11:43 p.m. as I navigated the winding roads through the Carpathian Mountains. The radio crackled with static, so I'd turned it off, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and my thoughts. I was tired, but not dangerously so. I'd done this route hundreds of times before. The moon was full that night, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The trees on either side of the road seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I remember thinking how strange the shadows looked, dancing across the road in front of me. It was almost hypnotic, watching them shift and change as I drove. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fatigue that was settling in. I knew I should stop soon, maybe grab a coffee at the next rest area. But something kept me going, nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't quite place. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to keep driving. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the moment everything changed, if somehow, deep down, I knew what was coming. The change was so sudden, so absolute, that for a moment I thought I must have fallen asleep at the wheel. 1 second I was driving through the dark, moonlit night, and the next, it was as if the sun itself had crashed down onto the road in front of me. The light was blinding, painful even through my closed eyelids. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt as I raised my arms to shield my face. The light seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, filling the cab of my truck and spilling out onto the road around me. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Not the warm yellow of sunlight or the harsh white of headlights, but a strange, otherworldly blue-white that seemed to pulse and throb with its own energy. As my eyes slowly adjusted, I could make out shapes moving within the light. They were dark silhouettes, tall and thin, with oddly elongated limbs. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came. It was as if the light had stolen my voice. The shapes were getting closer now, moving with an unnatural grace that made my skin crawl. I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape, but my muscles wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in my own body as the figures drew nearer. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. The blinding light, the road, my truck. It all vanished like smoke in the wind. I found myself in a place that defied description, a room that seemed to exist outside of normal space and time. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to shift and pulse with an inner light. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a metallic tang that made my tongue feel numb. It was bitingly cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever be warm again. But it wasn't the cold or the strange surroundings that made my blood run like ice in my veins. It was them. They stood around me, silent and still, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to scream. Their skin was a sickly greenish gray, smooth and almost translucent. I could see hints of a complex network of veins pulsing beneath the surface. But it was their eyes that truly terrified me. They were huge, dominating their faces, and so deeply black that they seemed to absorb all light. There was no white, no iris, just endless, fathomless darkness. I tried to move, to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. I was completely at their mercy, and the realization of that fact filled me with a terror so profound I thought I might go mad from it. I don't know how long they examined me. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that strange, sterile place. Their hands moved over my body with clinical precision, their touch cool and dry against my skin. I could feel them probing, measuring, taking samples. There was no pain, not in the traditional sense, but every nerve in my body screamed in protest at their alien touch. I wanted to fight, to push them away, but I remained paralyzed, unable to do anything but endure their invasive examination. Their fingers were long and thin, with too many joints, and they moved with an unsettling fluidity. As they worked, I could hear a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It throbbed in my skull, making it hard to think, hard to focus on anything but the immediate horror of my situation. I tried to close my eyes, to shut out the sight of their emotionless faces looming over me, but even that small act of defiance was beyond my control. I was forced to watch, to bear witness to every moment of this violation. At some point during the examination, one of them brought out a device I can only describe as a wand. It was long and slender, made of some shimmering material that seemed to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways. When they activated it, it emitted a soft blue glow that made my skin tingle and my teeth ache. They ran this device over every inch of my body, pausing occasionally to study the readings it gave them. I could see the curiosity in their huge black eyes, the clinical interest as they catalogued every detail of my physiology. It was then that the true horror of my situation hit me. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a specimen, a curiosity to be studied and dissected. I tried to speak, to plead with them, but no sound came out. My mind was screaming, begging them to stop, to let me go. But my body remained motionless, betraying nothing of the terror and anguish raging within me. As the examination continued, I began to notice subtle differences between my captors. Some were taller, some had slightly different shades of skin. One, who seemed to be directing the others, had markings on its chest that glowed faintly in the dim light. I latched onto these details, desperately trying to maintain some sense of sanity in this nightmare. Just when I thought I couldn't bear another moment of their cold, invasive touch, everything changed again. There was a sudden shift in the air, a feeling of pressure building around me. The beings stepped back, their movements becoming more agitated. I could sense a tension in the room, though their faces remained as impassive as ever. The humming sound grew louder, more insistent, and the walls of the room began to pulse with an intense, rhythmic light. I felt a surge of hope. Was this my chance to escape? But before I could even finish the thought, my vision began to blur. The room, the beings, everything started to swirl and fade, as if I was being pulled backwards through a tunnel. I tried to hold on, to stay conscious, but the force was too strong. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was those huge black eyes still watching me with that unsettling intensity. Then, nothing. When I came back to myself, I was sitting in my truck, parked on the side of the road. The engine was off, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling metal. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, and my whole body was drenched in a cold sweat. For a moment I thought it had all been a vivid, terrifying dream. But then I saw the time on the dashboard clock, 4:17 a.m. Nearly 5 hours had passed, but it felt like only minutes. My mind reeled, trying to process what had happened, what I had experienced. The memory of those beings, their cold touch and emotionless eyes, was already starting to fade, slipping away like sand through my fingers. But the fear, the deep primal terror of what had been done to me, that remained as sharp and real as ever. It took me several minutes to gather the courage to move, to release my death grip on the steering wheel, and actually look around. The road was deserted, eerily quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. There were no signs of the blinding light I'd seen, no marks on the asphalt, nothing to indicate that anything out of the ordinary had happened here. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it hadn't been a dream. The residual cold still clung to my skin, and there was a strange, metallic taste in my mouth that I couldn't shake. With trembling hands, I checked myself over, half expecting to find scars or marks from their examination. There were no visible signs, but my body felt different, wrong somehow, as if everything had been taken apart and put back together slightly out of alignment. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call someone, anyone. But who would believe me? Who could I possibly tell about this that wouldn't think I was crazy? As I stared at the screen, trying to decide what to do, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were several missed calls from my wife, and a text message asking where I was. I was supposed to have arrived at the processing plant hours ago. How was I going to explain this? What could I possibly say? With shaking hands, I started the truck and pulled back onto the road. Every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision made me flinch. I kept expecting to see those beings, to have the truck suddenly filled with that otherworldly light again. The drive to Bucharest was a blur of paranoia and barely contained panic. By the time I arrived at the processing plant, the sun was rising, casting a surreal glow over the city. The guard at the gate gave me an odd look as I pulled in, probably noting my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. I mumbled something about engine trouble, barely hearing my own words as I navigated to the unloading area. As I went through the motions of my job, my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it really been aliens? Was I losing my mind? The rational part of my brain wanted to dismiss it all as a vivid hallucination, maybe brought on by exhaustion or stress. But I couldn't shake the visceral memory of their touch, the cold sterility of that examination room, the depths of those impossibly black eyes. Over the next few days, I tried to go back to my normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. I was jumpy, constantly on edge, seeing threats in every shadow. Sleep became a thing of the past. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those beings looming over me. I made excuses to my wife about why I was acting so strangely, blaming it on stress from work, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, even if she couldn't possibly guess what. I started noticing other things too, small changes that I couldn't explain. My hearing seemed more acute, picking up sounds that I'd never noticed before. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch glimpses of strange symbols or patterns that would vanish when I tried to focus on them. And the dreams. When I did manage to sleep, my dreams were filled with fragmented images of star-filled skies and alien landscapes. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, with the certainty that I'd seen something I wasn't meant to remember. I began to wonder if they had done more than just examine me that night. Had they changed me somehow? Implanted something in my brain? The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. I started avoiding people, afraid that somehow they'd be able to tell that something was different about me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those beings were still observing me from afar. As the weeks passed, my obsession with what had happened that night only grew. I spent hours online, searching for similar accounts, trying to find anyone who had experienced something like I had. I found countless stories of alien abductions, but none that quite matched the details of my experience. The more I read, the more confused and frustrated I became. Some accounts seemed believable, others were clearly hoaxes or the ramblings of disturbed minds. But where did my experience fit in? Was I just another crackpot, imagining things that never happened? Or was I one of the few who had glimpsed a terrifying truth about our universe? I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I could remember about that night and the strange occurrences that followed. I drew sketches of the beings, trying to capture their alien features, the coldness in their eyes. But every time I tried to put pen to paper, the memories seemed to slip away, becoming more nebulous and dreamlike. It was as if my mind was fighting against itself, one part desperate to remember, another part equally determined to forget. About a month after the incident, I had my first real breakdown. I was driving my usual route through the mountains when suddenly, without warning, panic overwhelmed me. The road ahead seemed to stretch and distort, and for a terrifying moment I was certain that I was back in that alien examination room. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there gripping the steering wheel and fighting the urge to scream. It took hours for me to calm down enough to drive again. When I finally made it home, I broke down and told my wife everything. I expected her to think I was crazy, to maybe even leave me. But she listened, her face a mix of concern and confusion. She didn't believe me, not really, but she could see how much I was suffering. She convinced me to see a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma and PTSD. I was reluctant at first, afraid of being labeled as insane, but I was desperate for help, for someone to tell me that I wasn't losing my mind. The therapist listened to my story without judgment, asking questions about my life before the incident, my stress levels, my sleep patterns. She suggested that what I had experienced might have been a combination of sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations, exacerbated by the stress of long nights on the road. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept this rational explanation and move on with my life. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The experience had been too real, too visceral to be dismissed as a simple hallucination. Still, I went along with the therapy, hoping that talking about it would help ease the constant fear and anxiety I was living with. We worked on relaxation techniques, on grounding myself in reality when the memories became too overwhelming. Slowly, gradually, I started to feel more in control. The panic attacks became less frequent, the nightmares less vivid. But the underlying certainty of what had happened never wavered. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that what I had experienced was real. The therapy might have helped me cope, but it couldn't erase the truth of that night. As months turned into years, I learned to live with the knowledge of what had happened to me. I never fully recovered, never went back to being the person I was before that night on the mountain road. But I found ways to cope, to function in a world that suddenly seemed so much stranger and more terrifying than I had ever imagined. I changed jobs, leaving the long-haul routes for local deliveries that kept me close to home. I couldn't bear the thought of driving through those mountains again, of being alone on dark, isolated roads. My wife stood by me through it all. Constant source of support, even though I knew she never truly believed my story. We never talked about it directly anymore, but I could see the questions in her eyes sometimes. The worry when I'd wake up gasping from another nightmare. I found myself drawn to the night sky, spending hours staring up at the stars, wondering what else was out there. Every strange light, every unexplained sound, would send a jolt of recognition through me. Was it them coming back? Part of me was terrified at the thought, while another part almost hoped for it, longed for some kind of confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that it had all really happened. Over time, I began to notice subtle changes in myself that I couldn't explain. My reflexes seemed sharper, my senses more acute. Sometimes, I'd have flashes of intuition that bordered on precognition, knowing who was calling before I answered the phone, or having a strong feeling about which route to take to avoid traffic. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever those beings had done to me during that examination had changed me on some fundamental level. I started keeping a log of these occurrences, trying to find patterns, to make sense of what was happening to me. But for every instance that seemed truly inexplicable, there were dozens that could be explained away as coincidence or heightened awareness. I found myself constantly questioning everything, caught between wanting to believe in my own experiences and fearing that I was sliding into paranoia and delusion. The fear that I might be losing my grip on reality was almost as terrifying as the memory of the abduction itself. It was on the 5th anniversary of that night that something happened to shatter the fragile peace I had managed to build. I was in the backyard, stargazing as I often did, when I saw it, a light in the sky moving in ways that no earthly aircraft could. It zipped across the horizon, stopping and changing direction at impossible angles. My heart began to race, my palms sweating as I watched it dance across the stars. Then, suddenly, it was gone, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. For a moment I stood frozen, unable to process what I had seen. Then, without conscious thought, I was running into the house, grabbing my keys, heading for my car. I drove out to the mountains that night, to the very spot where it had all begun 5 years ago. I don't know what I expected to find, what I was hoping for. Confirmation? Closure? Another encounter? I sat in my car until dawn, watching the sky. My mind a whirlwind of emotions, fear, hope, dread, anticipation. But nothing happened. As the sun rose, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. I realized then that this would be my life now, always watching, always wondering, caught between two worlds. Today, as I write this, I'm still not sure what to make of everything that's happened. There are days when I can almost convince myself that it was all a vivid dream, a product of an overworked mind and too many nights on lonely roads. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, or feel a sudden chill that takes me right back to that sterile examination room, and I know that it was real. I've never shared my story publicly before. I'm not looking for belief or validation. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just putting this out there, adding my voice to the countless others who have experienced something they can't explain. Maybe someone reading this has gone through something similar. Maybe you're out there right now, questioning your sanity, feeling alone and afraid. If you are, I want you to know that you're not crazy, and you're not alone. Whatever is out there, whatever visited me that night and changed my life forever, it's real. And someday, somehow, the truth will come out. Until then, I'll keep watching. The skies, caught between fear of what might return and a strange, inexplicable longing to understand. Because once you've seen beyond the veil of our everyday world, once you've felt the touch of something truly alien, you can never go back. You can only move forward, carrying the weight of that knowledge with you, forever changed by a single night that redefined everything you thought you knew about the universe and your place in it. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, The Aliens Chosen, a Forest Encounter, Chile, 2003. It was just another day in the Chilean countryside, or so I thought. I'd been out hiking in the dense forests near my hometown, something I'd done countless times before. The familiar scent of pine and earth filled my nostrils as I made my way along the winding trail, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. I remember feeling at peace, surrounded by the quiet rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. But that serenity was about to be shattered, in a way I never could have imagined. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. The forest had fallen eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the day. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. That's when I saw it. A light unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't the warm glow of the setting sun or the harsh beam of a flashlight. This light was different, otherworldly. It seemed to pulse and shimmer, casting an eerie blue-white glow through the trees. My heart began to race as I stood there, transfixed by the sight. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body wouldn't respond. As the light grew brighter, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like static electricity dancing across my skin. The world around me began to blur and fade. And then, nothing. I came to with a start, my head pounding and my mouth dry as sandpaper. Disoriented, I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of my surroundings. I was still in the forest, lying on my back on the damp ground. The familiar scent of pine and earth filled my nostrils, but something felt off. As my vision cleared, I noticed the quality of light had changed. The sun had moved significantly in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Panic set in as I fumbled for my watch, my hands shaking. When I finally managed to focus on the dial, my blood ran cold. According to my watch, it was just past 2 p.m., the same time it had been when I first saw the strange light. But that couldn't be right. The sun's position told a different story. It had to be early evening now, maybe 6 or 7 p.m. My mind reeled as I tried to process what this meant. Hours had vanished, simply gone without a trace. I sat up slowly, my body aching as if I'd run a marathon. Every muscle protested, and I felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that I couldn't explain. As I looked around, trying to gather my thoughts, I noticed something else that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The forest floor around where I'd been lying was different. The leaves and undergrowth were flattened in a perfect circle, as if some immense weight had pressed down on them. And at the center of that circle was me. That's when I saw them. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, still adjusting to the dim light of early evening. But as I blinked and refocused, I realized what I was seeing was all too real. They were figures, but not like any I'd ever seen before. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. They moved with an eerie grace, gliding rather than walking across the forest floor. Their skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shimmer and shift, blending with the shadows around them. I couldn't make out any distinct features, just those elongated forms moving purposefully through the trees. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. But I remained frozen in place, unable to look away. As I watched, paralyzed by fear and fascination, I realized they were moving towards something. It took me a moment to comprehend what I was seeing, my brain struggling to process the impossible. There, partially obscured by the trees, was what I can only describe as a ship. It wasn't like any aircraft I'd ever seen. It seemed to pulse with the same otherworldly light I'd seen earlier, its surface rippling like liquid metal. The beings moved towards it with purpose, their forms becoming less distinct as they neared the glowing vessel. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there and watch. But my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was observe in silent horror as these creatures, these visitors from who knows where, prepared to depart. As the beings disappeared into their ship, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to follow them. It was as if some invisible force was pulling me towards that pulsating light. My legs trembled as I struggled to stand, my body protesting every movement. I took a hesitant step forward, leaves crunching under my feet. And that's when it hit me. A wave of memories so intense it nearly knocked me off my feet. Fragmented images flashed through my mind, sterile white rooms, strange instruments, faces that were both familiar and utterly alien. I remembered cold metal against my skin, a feeling of weightlessness, and a deep, penetrating hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. But these weren't just visual memories, they came with a flood of emotions, fear, confusion, and a bizarre sense of wonder. I remembered the terror of being completely helpless, strapped to some kind of table or chair. I recalled the sensation of unseen eyes studying me, probing not just my body, but somehow reaching into my mind. And beneath it all, there was a sense of communication. not with words, but with thoughts and images that seared themselves into my consciousness. I staggered backwards, overwhelmed by the onslaught of memories. My back hit a tree trunk, and I slid down to the ground, my legs no longer able to support me. As I sat there, gasping for breath, I realized something that chilled me to my core. Those missing hours, they weren't just gone. They were filled with experiences my mind was struggling to comprehend. Experiences that defied everything I thought I knew about the world. The sound of the ship powering up snapped me back to the present. I looked up just in time to see it rising above the treetops, its surface rippling like quicksilver in the fading light. There was no roar of engines, no blast of heat, just that deep, penetrating hum growing in intensity. The trees around me began to sway, not from wind, but from some invisible force emanating from the craft. I watched, transfixed, as it hovered for a moment, that otherworldly light pulsing in a hypnotic rhythm. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. No gradual acceleration, no fading into the distance. 1 second it was there, and the next it had vanished, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air where it had been. As the forest settled back into an eerie stillness, I became acutely aware of how alone I was. The typical sounds of the woods, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals were still absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind reeling, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a hallucination, some kind of vivid waking dream. But the ache in my body, the flattened circle of vegetation around me, and those fragmented memories told a different story. As the last light of day faded from the sky, I finally found the strength to stand. My legs were shaky, and every movement sent jolts of pain through my body. It was as if I'd been put through some kind of intense physical ordeal, which, I realized with a shudder, I probably had been. The walk back to civilization was a blur. I moved on autopilot, my mind still struggling to process what had happened. By the time I reached the edge of town, full dark had fallen. The familiar sights of my hometown, the glowing windows of houses, the streetlights, the occasional passing car, seemed surreal after what I'd experienced. It was like I'd stepped from one world into another, and I wasn't sure I belonged in either anymore. When I finally made it home, I collapsed onto my bed, still fully clothed. I wanted to sleep, to escape into unconsciousness and maybe wake up to find this had all been a terrible dream. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that strange ship, those otherworldly beings. I could feel phantom sensations. Cold metal against my skin, invisible forces holding me in place. And always, there was that deep, penetrating hum, resonating through my body and mind. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I became aware of something else. A change so subtle, I almost missed it at first. It was like a new awareness had awakened inside me, a sensitivity to things I'd never noticed before. I could feel the electromagnetic fields from the electronics in my room, a gentle buzzing that set my teeth on edge. When I finally did drift off into a fitful sleep, my dreams were filled with stars and distant worlds, complex mathematical equations I couldn't begin to understand, and a sense of vastness that both terrified and exhilarated me. I woke up feeling like I'd lived 1,000 lifetimes in the span of a few hours, my mind brimming with knowledge I couldn't quite grasp. In the days that followed, I struggled to return to some semblance of normalcy. I went through the motions of my daily life, going to work, interacting with friends and family. But everything felt hollow, disconnected. It was as if I was watching myself from a distance, going through the motions of a life that no longer fit. The worst part was the constant feeling that I was being watched, not by anything visible, but by some unseen presence that lingered just beyond the edge of perception. I'd catch myself staring at the sky, searching for something I couldn't name. At night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear that low, pulsating hum that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares. But it wasn't just the psychological effects that were troubling me. Strange things started happening around me. Electronics would malfunction when I got too close, lights flickering or screens going fuzzy. I'd get intense headaches that would come on suddenly, accompanied by flashes of those fragmented memories from my missing time. And sometimes, in moments of stress or deep concentration, I'd find myself understanding complex concepts that should have been far beyond my comprehension. It was as if something had been unlocked in my brain, giving me access to knowledge I'd never learned. I tried to rationalize it all away. Maybe I'd had some kind of stress-induced breakdown in the forest. Maybe I was developing migraines that came with visual auras. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had happened to me out there, something that had fundamentally changed me. And as much as I wanted to forget, to go back to my normal life, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. About a week after the incident, I decided I needed to go back to the forest. Part of me was terrified at the thought, but a larger part felt drawn there, as if answers to my questions might be waiting among the trees. I set out early one morning, my heart pounding as I retraced my steps from that fateful day. As I neared the spot where it had all happened, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like static electricity in the air. The forest seemed different here, quieter, more watchful. When I reached the clearing, I froze in my tracks. The circle of flattened vegetation was still there, a perfect imprint in the forest floor. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Scattered around the edge of the circle were small metallic objects that glinted in the dappled sunlight. With shaking hands, I picked one up. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A small disc, no larger than a coin, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. As I held it, it seemed to pulse with a faint energy, and for a moment I swore I could hear that familiar hum. I collected as many of these objects as I could find, stuffing them into my pockets. Part of me knew I should leave them alone, that I was tampering with evidence of something beyond my understanding. But I couldn't help myself. These tiny discs were the only tangible proof I had that I wasn't going crazy, that what had happened to me was real. As I stood there, pockets heavy with my strange finds, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had proof now, something I could study, something that might lead me to answers. But I also knew that by taking these objects, I was deepening my involvement in whatever this was. I was no longer just a victim of a strange experience. I was actively seeking answers, and I had no idea where that path might lead me. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with studying the strange discs I'd found. I spent every free moment examining them, trying to decipher the intricate patterns on their surfaces. I even bought a cheap microscope, hoping to uncover some hidden details. What I found only deepened the mystery. Under magnification, the patterns seemed to shift and change, revealing new complexities the longer I looked. And there was something else, a faint bluish glow that seemed to emanate from within the discs themselves. It was barely perceptible to the naked eye, but under the microscope it was unmistakable. I tried everything I could think of to analyze these objects. I weighed them, measured them, even tried to scratch their surface, which proved to be impossibly hard. But for all my efforts, I was no closer to understanding what they were or where they came from. What I did notice, however, was that my strange new abilities seemed to intensify when I handled the discs. The headaches would come on stronger, accompanied by vivid flashes of memory, or were they visions of star-filled skies and strange geometric structures that seemed to defy physics? And sometimes, in the quiet of night, I swore I could hear whispers coming from the discs, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but that seemed tantalizingly familiar. I knew I should have turned the discs over to authorities, to scientists who might be better equipped to study them. But the thought of parting with them filled me with an inexplicable dread. These objects were my only link to what had happened to me, my only hope of understanding the changes I was going through. And so I kept them hidden, my secret obsession, all the while feeling like I was balanced on the edge of a precipice, about to plunge into something far bigger and stranger than I could imagine. As the weeks turned into months, my life began to unravel. I couldn't focus at work, my mind constantly drifting to the discs and the mysteries they represented. My relationships suffered as I withdrew from friends and family, unable to explain what I was going through. I was living two lives, the facade of normalcy I presented to the world, and the secret world of my obsession with the alien artifacts. The strange occurrences around me intensified. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find all the electronics in my house turned on, screens displaying complex mathematical equations or star charts I didn't understand. Objects would move when I wasn't looking, as if some unseen force was rearranging my surroundings. And the dreams, they became more vivid, more real. I'd find myself walking through vast alien landscapes, structures of impossible geometry looming overhead. In these dreams, I could understand the whispers from the discs, could grasp the complex concepts that eluded me in waking life. But upon waking, the knowledge would slip away like water through my fingers, leaving me with only a maddening sense of having been on the verge of understanding something monumental. One night, about 3 months after my encounter, I woke to find myself standing in my backyard, the discs arranged in a perfect circle around me. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there or what I'd been doing. As I stood there, heart pounding, I saw a familiar blue-white light flickering at the edge of my vision. I turned, half expecting to see the alien ship descending. Instead, I saw only empty sky. But for a moment, just a brief instant, I thought I glimpsed something. A shape, a presence, watching me from the shadows. When I blinked, it was gone. I gathered up the discs with trembling hands and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. As I sat on my bed, clutching the discs to my chest, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could continue down this path of obsession and isolation, chasing answers that seemed to always be just out of reach, or I could try to let it go, to return to my normal life and pretend none of this had ever happened. But even as I considered it, I knew it was impossible. I was changed irrevocably. There was no going back. The turning point came about 6 months after my abduction. I'd been up late as usual, studying the discs under my microscope. The patterns had been particularly active that night, shifting and flowing like living things. As I watched, mesmerized, I felt a sudden, searing pain in my head. It was as if someone had driven a white-hot spike through my skull. I fell back, clutching my temples as waves of agony washed over me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain vanished. In its place came a clarity I'd never experienced before. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my mind. Suddenly I could understand. The patterns on the discs, the equations I'd seen in my dreams, the whispers I'd been hearing. It all made sense. I saw it all laid out before me like a vast, intricate tapestry. The nature of reality, the structure of the universe, the secrets of time and space. It was all there, encoded in those tiny metal discs. With shaking hands, I grabbed a notebook and began to write. The information poured out of me in a torrent. Complex mathematical formulas, detailed schematics for technology beyond anything humanity had ever created, star maps of distant galaxies. I wrote for hours, filling page after page, barely aware of my surroundings. When I finally stopped, the sun was rising. I looked down at what I'd written, my mind reeling. I knew without a doubt that what I held in my hands could change the course of human history. It was the key to unlocking the stars, to understanding the fundamental nature of the universe. But as that realization sank in, so did another more chilling thought. If this information was as world-changing as I believed, there would be people, governments, corporations, individuals who would stop at nothing to get their hands on it. And suddenly, I understood why I'd been chosen, why this knowledge had been given to me. It wasn't a gift. It was a burden, a responsibility. I was a custodian of secrets that could reshape the world for better or for worse. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and frantic activity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that shadowy forces were closing in on me. Every car that drove past my house, every stranger who glanced my way on the street, became a potential threat. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help it. The weight of the knowledge I now possessed was crushing me. I spent hours poring over the notes I'd written, trying to make sense of it all. Some of it was beyond my comprehension despite my newfound understanding. But other parts were terrifyingly clear. I saw plans for energy sources that could power entire cities indefinitely, for transportation systems that could cross vast distances in the blink of an eye. There were formulas that seemed to suggest the possibility of manipulating gravity, of bending the very fabric of space-time. It was world-changing stuff, the kind of knowledge that could launch humanity into a new age of enlightenment and exploration. But I also saw the potential for destruction. In the wrong hands, this information could be used to create weapons of unimaginable power to dominate and control on a global scale. The responsibility was overwhelming. I couldn't trust anyone with this information, but I couldn't bear the burden alone. I began to understand why the aliens, if that's truly what they were, had chosen to share this knowledge in such a roundabout way. Direct contact, direct transmission of this information would have been too much, too fast. The human race wasn't ready for it. But by giving it to me, by letting it filter through a human mind, they were introducing these concepts gradually, allowing for a slow dissemination that wouldn't upend the entire world order overnight. At least, that's what I told myself. It was the only way I could make sense of why this had happened to me, why I had been chosen for this impossible task. As the days wore on, I found myself caught in a constant state of conflict. Part of me wanted to share what I'd learned, to bring this knowledge to the scientific community and watch as it revolutionized our understanding of the universe. But another part, a more cautious, more fearful part, knew that doing so could be catastrophic. I thought about the discs still hidden away in my home. They were the physical proof of my experience, the key to unlocking the knowledge in my head. I knew I should destroy them, erase any trace of their existence. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. They were my lifeline, my connection to whatever beings had chosen to share this knowledge with me. Instead, I focused on trying to understand and translate the information I'd received into something more accessible, more human. I filled notebook after notebook with diagrams, equations, and theories. I worked in code, developing my own system of shorthand that would be meaningless to anyone but me. All the while, I grappled with the enormity of what I now knew. The universe was vaster and stranger than I'd ever imagined, filled with wonders and terrors beyond human comprehension. And we, humanity, were just taking our first tentative steps into that vastness. I saw now why the aliens had intervened, why they'd chosen to share this knowledge. We were like children playing with fire, on the verge of discoveries that could either elevate us to new heights or destroy us completely. They were guiding us, in their own inscrutable way, towards a future where we might join them among the stars. But the path to that future was fraught with danger, and I was now its unwilling guardian. About a year after my abduction, something changed. I woke up one night drenched in sweat with a certainty that I wasn't alone. The air in my bedroom felt charged, alive with an energy I'd come to associate with the presence of the aliens. I sat up, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was like the beings I'd seen in the forest, tall and impossibly thin, its form shimmering and indistinct in the darkness. But this time I wasn't afraid. Instead, I felt a sense of calm wash over me, as if I was in the presence of an old friend. The being didn't speak, not in words, but I felt its thoughts touch my mind. Images and concepts flowed between us, a wordless conversation that spanned the gulf between our species. I understood then that this was a check-in, an evaluation of how I was handling the knowledge they'd given me. They were pleased with my caution, my understanding of the responsibility I'd been given. But they were also concerned. They showed me visions of possible futures, some bright and filled with wonder, others dark and terrifying. I saw humanity reaching for the stars, and I saw us tearing ourselves apart with technologies we weren't ready to control. The message was clear. The future was not set. The knowledge I possessed could tip the balance one way or the other. As the aliens' presence began to fade, I felt a sense of purpose settle over me. I knew now that I couldn't keep this knowledge entirely to myself, but I also couldn't release it all at once. I had to find a way to guide humanity gently towards that brighter future, to plant the seeds of understanding that would eventually blossom into a new era of discovery and exploration. In the years that followed, I walked a delicate line. I began publishing papers in obscure scientific journals, presenting theories that pushed at the boundaries of current understanding without fully crossing them. I took a job at a university where I could influence young minds and steer promising students towards the areas of research I knew would be crucial in the coming decades. All the while, I kept the full extent of my knowledge hidden, revealing only fragments that the world was ready to accept. It wasn't easy. There were times when I wanted to shout the truth from the rooftops, to reveal everything I knew and damn the consequences. But every time I was tempted, I remembered those visions of possible futures, and I held back. I watched as humanity made slow but steady progress, inching closer to the truths I already knew. I saw theories proposed that aligned with the knowledge in my head, and I felt a mixture of pride and frustration. Pride at how far we'd come, frustration at how far we still had to go. The discs remained hidden, my secret tether to that night in the forest. Sometimes, late at night, I'd take them out and study them, marveling at how such small objects could contain such vast knowledge. And sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of that shimmering presence at the corner of my eye, a reminder that I wasn't alone in my vigil. As I aged, I began to worry about what would happen to this knowledge when I was gone. I had no children, no one to pass this burden to. But somehow, I knew that when the time came, the aliens would choose another. My role was not to be the sole keeper of this knowledge, but to be a bridge, a stepping stone on humanity's journey to the stars. Now, as I write this, I'm an old man. My hair has gone grey. My hands shake as I type. But my mind is as sharp as ever, still brimming with the knowledge given to me all those years ago. I've seen humanity take its first real steps into space, seen theories proposed that inch ever closer to the truths I've known for decades, and I know that soon, very soon, we'll reach a tipping point. The discoveries will come faster, the breakthroughs more frequent, as we approach the threshold of a new era. I don't know if I'll live to see it, but I can feel it coming. Sometimes, on clear nights, I sit outside and look up at the stars. I think about the vastness out there, the wonders and mysteries waiting to be discovered. And I think about those beings, those silent watchers who chose to share their knowledge with me. I wonder if they're out there now, watching our progress, guiding other species as they guided us. I wonder if someday we'll join them out there among the stars. As for the discs and the notebooks filled with my coded writings, I've made arrangements. When I'm gone, they'll find their way to the right people, those who are ready to take up the mantle and guide humanity forward. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the best I can do. My abduction, my missing time, changed everything. Not just for me, but for all of humanity. Though most will never know it. It set us on a path, a journey that will take us to the farthest reaches of the universe. And though that journey has only just begun, I have hope. Hope that we'll use this knowledge wisely, that we'll reach for the stars with open minds and peaceful hearts. Because out there in the vast expanse of space, we're not alone. And someday, we'll be ready to truly understand what that means. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.